Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the CEO and founder of the Epic Project, a nonprofit organization that's nurturing a generation of men who won't buy sex. My guest today is a little unusual because if you listen to the podcast regularly, you're probably going to recognize her voice. You would have heard her introducing the show, talking about sponsors. I'm talking about Lauren Trantham. And yes, while she produces the Masculine Wilderness Podcast, she's also our director of communications and donor relations at Epic Project. And she does other stuff, lots of other stuff. For example, Lauren is the founder and the executive director of Ride My Road, an educational and fundraising organization that's hosted events across the country and educated thousands of community members. It's raised over $400,000 for survivor-led initiatives. And as a photographer, Lauren has photographed nearly 100 American survivors of human trafficking. Most recently, Lauren and Ride My Road hosted the Alaska Data Summit and the Southern Oregon Human Trafficking Disruptors Summit, which if you caught our recent bonus episode, you'll know that that's included presentations by Justin Utenheier, who's also going to be on this podcast, and he's our director of programs, as well as presentations that I gave at that summit. I wanted Lauren to be a guest on this podcast to talk about a whole bunch of things. In it, we talk as a man and a woman who are partners in this work together and how the world is experienced differently for a man and for a woman. Lauren shares a lot of her personal background and insight that she's learned in her own journey as someone who has been on the receiving end of abuse and how she has fought and grown and overcome those things. And there's overlap there. It's a fascinating conversation. It's a very fun conversation. She's one of the most delightful people that I've met in this work. And I know you're going to enjoy the wisdom and the humility that Lauren brings. Please remember that this is a conversation that touches on sexual violence, and it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma that's a part of this topic. We simply want to strive to speak truthfully about the damage that's being done. So thank you for joining us today as we explore more of this masculine wilderness.
In today's episode, we would like to highlight our partner organization, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, also known as NCOSE. NCOSE is the leading nonprofit organization exposing the links between all forms of sexual abuse and exploitation. Taking down the multi-billion-dollar sexual exploitation industry is no easy feat. NCOSE has built the infrastructure that is equipped to stand toe-to-toe against the world's pornographers, pimps, sex traffickers, sex buyers, and exploitation profiteers. With an expansive grassroots network, research institute, embedded litigation law firm, training teams, and global coalition, paired with their cutting-edge public policy and corporate advocacy tactics, NCOSE is realizing major progress every day. Victories that used to take years are now happening within weeks. Learn more about NCOSE at endsexualexploitation.org.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, Lauren Trantham. I'm really excited and proud to introduce our folks. She's the voice behind the podcast, probably for people that are listening regularly. But she's way more than that. Lauren is she's one of my best friends in this work. She is a teammate at Epic that does way more than most people know. And I first met her. When did you do the ride?
2016.
In 2016, I met her in a gas station parking lot in Eugene, Oregon. It's never been the same since. So welcome, Lauren. That's my version of the story. What's yours?
Yeah, well, I had heard about you from our mutual friend, Rebecca Bender. But then it took me another 6 to 8 months to register who you were and to put you together with the work that you were doing at Epic. And it wasn't until later that we partnered. But it's cool that we have that story of meeting.
Tell them what you were doing that day. That's
So
kind of the beginning.
Yeah. I have an organization called Ride My Road, and I started it in 2016. I rode my motorcycle 10,000 miles across the United States, meeting and photographing American survivors of human trafficking. And it was this huge endeavor. And we partnered with Rebecca Bender and the Elevate Academy. And I was on the road for 2 months, and I met you on day one. And so I think that's why I didn't register who you were, because it was such a big emotional day for me. And then I went on and 2 months, I was 2 months on the road. So it was just all a blur.
I remember meeting you. I was struck by how tiny you were. It looks like we're the same size, but we're not. We are not. Anyway, just this petite woman on a big ass motorcycle, just loaded, to the gills with gear. And I had ridden down to Eugene, a couple hours from where we live in Vancouver, Washington, with a couple other friends that were riders, and then we rode with you back up to Portland. And the other part of that story that I remember so fondly, do you remember, I think it was Shannon, a gal that Rebecca had been working with. She met us there too with Shannon, and Shannon was a survivor. Rebecca asked me if it would be okay if Shannon rode with me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about a 2-hour drive. And what I remember, and I was like, of course, I was really honored that she would ask me and trust me. And so Shannon's on the back of my bike, and what I remember, we're just going up the freeway. I remember her, I could see in my rearview mirror, I could see her at several points along the way, her arms were just out to the side, like she was flying.
Aww.
And the story she told me, or I think it was Shannon that told me afterwards, was that she has very fond memories of riding a motorcycle with her dad. And that part of her life had, kind of been cut off abruptly because of her exploitation. So that was one of the very first experiences I had with a survivor, kind of in that setting. And I felt privileged. So it was cool to meet you and to have that experience today. So I remember it clearly, obviously. What's some of the backstory to why you started that ride? What was your origin story in getting involved in this work?
I tell it a lot, as you know, and it's always so crazy to think back. But I really started this endeavor I came from a place of like real heartbreak, like a real rock bottom moment where I wanted to see if I could pull myself out of a really dark place by sort of looking outside of myself and trying to overcome emotional abuse in my marriage. I was going through a divorce, and I just like had this crazy idea, like, what if I can really, I think, ultimately escape my life? At the time I might not have been able to admit that, but what if I can just like get out of here and meet people who had experienced abuse and survived it, and maybe they could teach me how to survive it. And that's when I met Rebecca Bender, and we cooked up this plan for me to go on the road and do professional portrait photography for survivors that had graduated her online school. And I don't know, it just, looking back, I'm like, who does that? Like, what? That is insane. Like, how do you even come up with that? But I don't know. We did it, and here we are 8 years later, still doing it.
It's interesting that you said you did this out of a place of brokenness. The irony is it's similar. My origin story has a similar theme. Like, I had gone through a season that felt really emasculating for me, health problems, losing a job, all that, all this failure. And I started Epic in a similar place where I'm like, well, I'll do something manly and rescue vulnerable women. And it's the same theme, because it was the survivors that actually taught me a different perspective on that. So
yeah, it sounds very familiar to my story.
Yeah. Our paths just kind of went like this for several years then. So we did several events together, motorcycle events, because we share that passion for riding motorcycles. We did an event in Southern California. Tell us a little bit. And I'm thinking of the first one where we built the first survivor bike. And why, by me, I mean you. Tell us about that, and then I want to talk about where that led.
Well, when we decided to partner on what we called at the time the fast rides, I think it's really cool because Ride My Road, like we have done a lot of really cool stuff, and a lot of that cool stuff actually came from your brain. I can't remember why we decided we wanted to do a motorcycle giveaway, but it was definitely born out of conversations with you and ideas that you had. So part of what we do at Ride My Road in our programs is called the Survivor Bike. And we take motorcycles and we fix them up and make them look beautiful and bring on all kinds of people. And then we give them away. And with those funds, we give them to survivor-led organizations. And so we did that on one of our first events. We did it was a Ninja, right? I think it was a Ninja.
An old 90s.
It's like a really old Ninja.
Honda,
it was neon green.
Yeah,
and,
or Kawasaki.
Yeah, Kawasaki. And that was cool. My dad and I took a winter and we stripped it down and rebuilt it back up. And that was a really unique thing to get to do with my dad and to be able to give it away. I think we raised, I can't remember. I think like $8,000 or something with that first bike.
Yeah.
Which was so cool.
And we've done 3 so far, right?
That's 4.
4.
Yeah.
Okay. What's so cool to me about that particular story, and it's the dad in me, is the thought of you and your dad in your dad's shop spending all winter. What did you estimate? 200 plus hours?
Yeah.
Stripping this thing down and rebuilding it. I wish, and maybe when we do the final production, maybe if we could figure out a way to put a picture of it in there. It was a beautiful thing. And you didn't just rebuild it with your dad. This is something about you that I want people to know is your capacity for collaboration. So you put the word out there and you leveraged every social media connection and connection in the moto community to get parts donated, all kinds of things, including a local artist, fabulous artist, Michelle Boucher, who actually did the Masculine Wilderness logo. But she created artwork for the tank. You drew everyone into the project, and the outcome was stunning. So I had the opportunity to, on the way down, drove down and. Didn't I pick up that bike, or was that the second one?
That was the third bike, I think.
Oh, it was the third bike. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's right. Yes, right. Anyway, I just remember seeing that thing the day we gave it away, and it was beautiful. But the really cool part of that is the way you kind of have that Pied Piper effect that you draw everyone in, and you've done that over and over again. So that event then opened a door that I don't think either of us saw coming.
No, I don't think so. People in the motorcycle community probably know about the Sturgis Rally, but if you don't, it's the largest motorcycle rally in the world. That happens once a year in South Dakota. 600,000, 700,000, 800,000 bikers converge on this area in the Black Hills.
Town of 6,000 people.
Yeah. But yeah, you and I, like at Epic Project and Ride My Road, kept collaborating, and we got a decent amount of media for the stuff that we're doing, and somehow or another, the director of the rally heard about what we were doing and invited us personally to the Sturgis Rally. It was the first year, and I think this was 2019. It was the first year that the rally, I believe, had taken sort of a public stance against human trafficking and the trafficking that happens at the Sturgis Rally. And it was just really, really cool. I know you have a great story about that, but I think it's, you talk about collaboration. I think it's just, I don't know, I just feel really lucky and really blessed in this work that every time we turn around, there's doors opening for us, and just sort of reiterating that this work is important.
The year before we actually did the event, he invited us out to see it. And I had never been out there before. I don't think you had either. And so you and I, and then one of our board members, Ken, the 3 of us met up in Sturgis the year before we did our event to meet with the director of the rally and kind of get a bird's eye view of what's happening. And I can remember that day that you and I both showed up. Ken came in later in the day, I think, and we got to Main Street. And you said it's the largest motorcycle rally in the world. The way I just would describe it, it's the largest concentration of fat, sweaty white guys wearing leather, pretending to be outlaws in the world. It's
Yeah.
and it's a motorcycle rally. But anyway, it's just so you have this. Everything that is iconically, good or bad, iconically masculine, just on full display. Loud motorcycls. I think there's gun vendors there. I know there's knife and but it's
and smoking,
drinking and smoking and loud, parties and all that kind of stuff. And so you have all these guys that look mostly like me, and a ton of women that look more like you. And I can remember you and I are walking down the street, but the difference between the men and the women is the men are all dressed up in, biker cosplay costumes, and the women are wearing next to nothing. And I can remember you and I walking down the street and we're like assaulted by that. Do you remember that? Do you remember that moment? Because you said something to the effect, I don't see how this is empowering for women, or something to that effect. And it was, it just always stuck with me because it's coming from you, a woman, seeing it firsthand. But what was your impression as we were walking down that street?
Yeah. Well, personally, I've personally gone through quite a journey, right? Like even just being a woman in today's day and age, like trying to figure out what is empowering and what's my right and what is good for me as a person, as an individual, and for femininity. And, we talk about the masculine wilderness, but it's not unlike what women are also going through, I think, in this time, especially with the hypersexualization that we talk about. So for me, it's like when I went on the road and I met all of these survivors of human trafficking, it changed my idea of what is empowering. When I learned about people who have experienced extreme sexual abuse, and then we live in this society where everything is hypersexualized, it was a real kind of a flip-flop for me in my understanding of that issue of, like, if I'm standing naked on the corner at Sturgis and all I have on is body paint, because that's what we saw, right? We saw like legit naked women with just body paint, being like, honestly, just leered at, and almost like a circus freak or something, because all the guys come up and they want to take pictures with you, and just kind of like looking at that kind of a thing that might not have bothered me in the past, like through this new lens after having this deep understanding of sexual exploitation and meeting so many people who were at the brunt of that. It was just a weird time. And I had been to like tons of bike rallies. I lived near Florida and had been to Bike Week like 8 years in a row. And while Sturgis is larger, it's not very dissimilar. So it was like, I used to go to those rallies and not really think anything of it, because we talk about this cultural lens, right? Like what's normal. That was just kind of like, oh yeah, well, and then to come to a rally with a different set of eyes, it was just, You
kind of lent me your eyes in that experience too, because you were just sharing with me in real time how that was affecting you as a woman. And it was different for me because I grew up in that culture that normalized that stuff. And if I hadn't learned what I learned from survivors, learned what I learned from you, I probably still would have felt somewhat uncomfortable, but I would have probably been more likely to shrug it off. And being there with you and knowing you and knowing what we knew collectively about where all of this led, I couldn't shrug it off anymore. We worked with a local survivor in an organization there too for that event, and the gal, she was older at that time, but had been trafficked as a minor at the Sturgis rally herself. And, and so kind of seeing it through her eyes, it was troubling to see the masculine culture that I grew up in through someone else's eyes. And that was what you helped me experience.
That makes sense.
That. Yeah.
When you meet survivors and you hear their stories and you think of someone like the survivor that we were working with at the Sturgis rally who was trafficked there, you would have seen her and not known, because people who are trafficked at the rally are not locked in cages, right? We talk about this all the time, but they are out on the street corner just kind of flaunting it all. Or so it's like I say I look at life through a different lens. I'm walking down the street on Sturgis saying, like, how did these girls get here? You know, like, have they been coerced? Like, what was told to them before they got here? Like, how long? Like, there's just all of these questions now that I have to always think of that's so much deeper than just looking at it on the surface level of like, oh, well, she's a woman and that's empowering, period. And maybe it is. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying we don't know.
I think for me too, it was a formative thing in terms of showing me what collaboration and partnership looks like with women. I hadn't really done much with other women or women's groups other than getting to know, survivors and survivor-led organizations prior to that. I think the other thing that's important, I think I want to make a connection here, and I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Like, so you're experiencing that, you're thinking through all that, you're kind of sharing your perspective with me, but you are not a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. There is some overlap in your own story that I think is relevant here. And again, this is something that you have taught us over the years. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, my story starts with emotional abuse. And particularly when we're talking about pimp-controlled trafficking, almost all the time it starts with emotional abuse. So the things that I was experiencing in my marriage are verbatim what survivors of trafficking experience before their trafficking begins. And I had actually learned that, when I wanted to go on the road the first time, I remember that Rebecca Bender, we had met and we had agreed that we were going to do this partnership together. And then she, the next step was she introduced me to her team, and she sent out an email to her staff, and we were going to do this big Zoom meeting with the staff, and she has staff all over the country, and it was really cool. And she had introduced me in that email as like a survivor of domestic violence. And I was very uncomfortable. And I said, whoa, like, I don't want to misrepresent what's going on here. Like, I was never beaten. I could not stomach the thought of calling myself a survivor of domestic violence. And she said to me, have you ever seen the power and control wheel? And it's this wheel that they use for domestic violence. And basically it outlines the different types of abuse and what's considered domestic abuse. And it was like, oh, the things that I had experienced, technically they can be categorized as domestic abuse. And I just, that was really hard for me because I didn't see myself through that lens. But, that's also what happens to survivors of trafficking. Like, most of the time they don't even identify as trafficking survivors. So it makes sense that me, as like just a woman who's not been trafficked, but also never been hit, can't identify myself as like a victim of that. So it's pretty wild.
And yet on a relational and a emotional level, you were victimized in legitimate ways, but you didn't see yourself that way, right?
It took me a long time to come to terms with that, and it actually like sparked a whole identity crisis. Like, how can I be a victim of abuse and keep my identity intact of this like independent, intelligent, traveled, cultured, like beautiful person who came from a great home? Like, I could not reconcile those things. And it really did throw me into an identity crisis, which Ride My Road was born out of my identity crisis.
Yes. brings us back to that gas station in Eugene,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
How long did it take you to work through that identity crisis? And were there specific things that helped you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, so emotional abuse, there's a lot of things that can happen under that umbrella, but it really is also like a stripping of your identity. Like, when we think about like breaking people down and building them up, like what they do in the military, and like there's all of these like psychological tactics that abusers use to undermine your identity. And when they undermine your identity, they therefore have control. What's creepy about it is that I don't think abusers go around reading books on how to do this. They just naturally figure out how to manipulate, but across the board, it's all of the same tactics. It's like, I would read articles and I'd be like, did this person who wrote this article know my ex-husband? Because it was so jarring of the similarities of when you read about narcissistic abuse. It was like, how is this such a thing that all abusers are doing? But so to answer your question, when you have your identity undermined like that, it can take a lifetime. I still deal with that stuff. It's been 8 years since my divorce, and I never saw him again, which at the time was like very difficult. But like I look back and I think I was so lucky that he just jetted. We didn't have children together, which is a totally different story. People who have to co-parent with narcissistic abusers I really feel for them. But even with him completely out of my life, I heard his voice in my head. I still hear his voice in my head sometimes. You're lazy. You don't inspire me. All the things he used to say to me, and like I would take as like biblical almost, because he knew me, and they take time to sort of like get into your psyche in that way, and it's a lot of brainwashing, and that's
the thing that's the common thread between your experience and a lot of survivors, is that it starts with that kind of emotional manipulation
for pimp controlled trafficking.
Pimp control.
Yes. If we're talking about familial or
that's
it's different. But yeah, I mean, right. I've probably even gang trafficking is probably similar in that regard. But yeah, the toll that it takes is absolutely abusive and devastating. And now I can look at that power and coercion and control wheel and say like, yeah, okay, like that makes sense to me.
So I'm hearing you share that story, and I've known this part of your story, but hearing you in this conversation share it, the two things come to mind. One is that experience as a big old white guy in American culture is like, man, that must suck. Because like in the way I was raised and formed in the masculine culture, like no one ever did that to me, at least not that I'm aware of or maybe willing to admit. But it's a foreign experience. So I'm hearing that in my head. I'm listening to you and knowing you like I do. I would never guess that by looking at you.
Just how we meet survivors of trafficking and we're like, what? You look like a normal person.
Yeah. In your experience, and I'm talking broader than just trafficking victims, but it's just in your experience with women, with the culture of women, your friends, and just what you've seen, how common is that kind of experience for women? What's it like, broadly speaking?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder, like, when you like want a green car and then you see green cars everywhere or whatever that phenomenon is, like I see abuse often. And yes, a lot of my friends are survivors of human trafficking. So, but I recently wrote a blog post for the Epic Project, for our blog, the Masculine Wilderness blog, talking about this, because when I hear about abuse, when I think about abuse, to me, it's everywhere. It's so prevalent. And I started thinking, like, is this just because of my job? Like, talking about that lens of how I look at the world now. Am I just like seeing abuse everywhere? And I know the statistics are 1 in 3 women will experience some sort of intimate partner violence in her lifetime. And
every time I hear that, I get a lump in my throat. I have 3 daughters. Because you have 3 daughters. Yeah. I want to read a quote from what you wrote, and I want to encourage everyone that's listening to this to read this. It is a gut punch, but I think it's really important. I'll let you fill in the details of the encounter you had with a guy who was my age. He said he doesn't know anyone that was a victim of this kind of violence. And you said his words resounded in my ears, and I felt that old familiar knot in my throat begin to form, the same knot that I have swallowed down my entire life, the knot that grows like a stone when I feel small, and it sits on my neck like a brick in moments when I want to shout out a truth, but I don't, or can't, or won't. As women, most of us hold this knot in our collective throats, one that is filled with the pain of the things we know but cannot always say. While not all women have been abused, all women do have a best friend, a niece, a mother, a cousin, or a coworker who has been abused. We also know that abuse is prolific and possible at any moment in any place to any of us. I mean, it's a chilling description of what the world is like for women.
Yeah.
Can you shed more light on that? When you first shared it with me and I read it, I'm like, oh, this is going to hurt.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important for men to understand this. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I always feel like using the disclaimer because I don't want people to like turn away from the conversation and just like think like, oh, well, women who are vocal about this must just like hate all men or something, right? Like I have so many good men in my life. I have such a beautiful relationship with so many men, including my dad, including you, the Epic guys. And so first I want to say that, but second is like all it takes is one. And that's kind of what we see statistically is that it's like a smaller group of men are abusing like lots of women, right? And so that's just like my caveat. But yeah, so when I wrote the blog post, I was concerned that maybe I was just looking at life through this lens that we work in, which is really horrible and dark and just so nasty. But so then I actually did like what a good nerd does, and I sat down and I wrote a spreadsheet, and I took.
You are nerdy that way.
I do love a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
I sat down and I thought about the 16 closest women in my life. Some I'm related to, some are my friends, some are in their 20s, some are in their 70s. And I put them down anonymously and I started remembering back on conversations with these women. And again, they come from all walks of life. Some live in the East Coast, the West Coast.
And these are not survivors.
These are not survivors of trafficking. I didn't want to include that because that will obviously skew sort of my own non-peer-reviewed research. But I just started thinking back on a lifetime of conversations with some of the most important women to me in my life. And I think it was 14 out of 16 had experienced some form of abuse, whether it was financial abuse, emotional abuse, all the way up to rapes, assaults, domestic violence, horrible beatings. Most of the time, actually every time, it was at the hands of men in their lives that they were married to or related to.
So it wasn't strangers.
No, we're not talking strangers. So,
wow.
Yeah. And so to circle back to the conversation you mentioned that I had with this gentleman, which prompted this blog post about like men coming forward and saying like, well, I don't know any women who've been abused. And women are over here like, we almost don't know a woman who hasn't been abused. There's a real disconnect. And these are good men, right? These aren't men that are just purposefully turning a blind eye. There's a real disconnect in how we continue to discuss this issue.
Why do you think that is?
Well, part 2 of the blog will be coming out soon. But I think it's a lot of historical and cultural reasons. Like we talk about law enforcement and how, up until the 80s, we had a culture in law enforcement that that's why you call it a domestic, like that stuff stays in the home. Yeah. And we didn't prosecute domestic violence offenders. We didn't, it was always just like, that's your business, right? So we have that in our history. We've come a long way since the 80s.
Yeah.
But that's like, we only just hit 50 years since a woman could even access her own finances. Like women weren't allowed a credit card unless their husband or their father came and signed just 50 years ago. We just hit that anniversary.
So in my lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So imagine your daughters wanting to buy a house and they have to come and get your signature. And, it's like, that wasn't that long ago.
It would be wise if they got their mother's signature. Mine not so much, but yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, so that changes in my lifetime. I'm 63. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's just a lot like cultural, that's why I say like historical stuff about policy, the way that we looked at domestic violence, the way we treated it. And then I think like there's just a general cognitive dissonance. Like, it's hard to think that every woman in your life has experienced abuse, and it's hard. I think it's harder. Like, we've come to like at least understand that this happens. It's much harder to look at the men in our lives and think, have these men abused? Have they been abusive? That's where the cognitive dissonance lies for me, because in order to accept and understand and truly absorb the fact that all of these women in our life have been abused, we have to then accept the opposite of that there's men out here that are doing the abusers, and we know them. They're not creepy guys in vans or strangers. Right. Like, we know them.
I would also add to that, from a guy's standpoint, there's also I guess you'd call it the guilt of our silent complicity, because even though I didn't do those things, I probably did know guys that did, and I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
I did, and I didn't call that out. And that feels weighty, kind of from my perspective. It's not as, I don't think it would be as debilitating as like what you're talking about for women, but there's an element of silent complicity too.
Yeah. You've mentioned that before, and I'm so interested in that word complicity. It's such a tricky word, and I think it's a scary word, because you have to take responsibility, and maybe I don't want to take responsibility for that. I mean, it's just like with any tragedy in the world. What
do you do when you realize that 40 years ago you should have said something and you didn't, and women were hurt? That's my story. I'll go in. I'm happy to go into that at some point. But like, there were times when I was in college when I saw this stuff going on, and I turned a blind eye because I was afraid of the rejection of my own masculine culture, my own community of men. So, I mean, that kind of thing hasn't happened since. But so I'm looking back on it going, holy cow. I didn't know it then. So what do I'm not asking you to solve my problems.
Well,
what do you do with that?
I have a thought. I mean, I think you're doing it. Okay. You're doing it now by having these conversations and speaking out now. And this whole work that's being done at Epic Project is for the next generation of men, right? The tagline is to nurture a next generation of men that doesn't sexually exploit. Yeah. That could also include that doesn't do domestic violence, that doesn't do emotional abuse, that isn't, you're doing it, Tom.
That's still hard. And I know I'm not the only guy who struggles with that, because I think we all, if we're honest, we look back in our lives as men and realize there are a lot of times where we, it's the coulda, shoulda, woulda. I don't think it's false guilt, but there's some real sorrow there when you get to know people like you work with them. We've done a lot together in our partnership in this work. And like you come to respect people like this, and you realize it's the world that you experience as a woman is very different from the world that I experience as a man, even though it's the same, it's the same culture. And how do you kind of let's bring it back up to like just present day. How do you maintain your just mental, emotional, spiritual equilibrium through all of this? You're so steady in your disposition and in the way you carry yourself in the world. Like, how do you do that, carrying all of the things that you carry and knowing the things that you know?
I think I have a real dedication to my truth. And my truth is incredibly optimistic. Like I said before, like there's so many good men in this world, and there's so much hope that we can change and we can continue to have these conversations. And I think just never forgetting the truth of that like, this is good. Like there's goodness. Yeah. And I get really sad when I see people that are cynical or hopeless, or it's like, that's not really helping any of us.
Yeah.
Right.
And you are almost completely lacking in cynicism, which amazes me.
I don't even know how to, it's not genuine. I think cynicism to me is sort of a lack in authenticity, because you're sort of like throwing up your hands and saying, well, it is what it is, so I might as well accept it. And I just think that's inauthentic. I think like you wouldn't even have to say it is what it is, I accept it, if it didn't bother you on some level. So getting down to that level, and kind of shying away from that reaction to just say, well, I can't do anything about it.
You harbor no malice towards men,
No.
which I think is amazing. And yet, like, I'm curious to know more just about you going out in the world. One of my favorite things to say about you is, she be small, but she be mighty. Like you have this fearlessness about it. Like, how do you do that? I know that you practice jujitsu. I know that you know how to handle a firearm. I know that you have traveled by yourself internationally multiple times. Like, there's a lot of women that, that wouldn't do those kinds of things. How, like, what gives you confidence just to move about in the world?
I don't know. My mom said that raising me was like trying to hold a tiger by the tail. I think I kind of, in some ways, came out that way. I've also been nurtured by my parents. I think they're a really good balance of those characteristics. And, I was raised with a decent amount of no quit. And, if something scares you, you're better off facing it.
I'm thinking of the coyote story.
Yeah, camping with coyotes.
Tell that story. I think that's so cool.
Yeah. So there's this story that I grew up on of my dad. My family's from New Mexico, and they're very sort of like Western. And we have this expression in my house called "get Western with it." Have you heard that expression?
I have not. No, I haven't heard that.
So like if like you're having a hard time, like, I don't know, like unscrewing a lid from a jar, or working on something in the garage, or you just it was always like, oh, this is hard. And the expression that came from my dad was like, well, get Western with it, which means like really give it like, give it the oomph, give it the, give it the muscles, like don't give up, like get Western with it. So we came from kind of that culture, I think, as a family. And then my dad tells this story that he was visiting a family friend who was this old cowboy called Lee Duncan. And he...
true story, right?
This story. Is a true story. This is my dad. My dad told me this story when I was about probably 12 or 13 or 14, and it changed my life. And so the story goes that he's over there visiting Lee Duncan in the trailer house, and he kind of looks out the window in the dark. It was nighttime or evening time, and in the middle of nowhere, like BFE, New Mexico. My family is like from, and there was a fire up on the hillside. Someone had a campfire going, and my dad said, Lee, like someone's up in your hills. And Lee kind of like saunters over and looks out the window, and he says, yeah, that's Jan. And Jan was Lee's daughter. And my dad was like, well, what's she doing up there? And Lee said, Jan is afraid of coyotes, and she went up there, and she ain't coming back down until she ain't afraid of coyotes no more. And my dad was like, how long has she been up there? And Lee said, oh, about 3 days.
Oh my gosh.
I recently told this story, and I said that Jan was around 19 at the time, and my dad corrected me, and he said, no, I think she was probably about 14.
Wow.
She was much younger. And that story, I heard that when I was young, and I marveled at it. Like, oh, you can actually be afraid of something and like do something about it. And I've used this analogy through my whole life. And I've done, like you said, I've done a lot of crazy things. I did martial arts my whole life. I left home at 17 and moved to Guatemala. I pretty much didn't come home from South America for like till I was 25 or something. Like I traveled all over the world. I backpacked through Central America. I speak 3 languages. I went on to get my pilot's license. That was a scary story. I started businesses. I've spoken in front of hundreds and hundreds of people. Like and I think that story was foundational for me of just understanding that, like, oh, you don't have to be special. Like
just to be willing to camp with the coyotes.
You have to be willing to camp with your coyotes, and maybe, like I talk about, like maybe your coyotes is like going to therapy. Like maybe that really scares the shit out of you, you know. And I, as a person who has also camped all over the country by myself off the back of my motorcycle, like and growing up, I grew up in Alaska, right? There's nothing worse than being in a tent and there's just like a thin strip of nylon between you and your worst fears, whether it's the men who were across the campsite leering at me all evening.
Wow.
Which has happened. You know, you crawl into that tent and you're like, this could go real wrong. And you have to stay there all night. Like that's, or whether it's coyotes howling outside your tent.
What would be camping with the coyotes for men? I mean, I think I have some answers to that, but I like knowing what you know. What do you think is the masculine equivalent of camping with the coyotes? What are the things that you see that men are afraid of that we need to face?
I mean, I do think vulnerability is up there. And I know
say more about what that word means when you use it.
Yeah, that's a buzzword, right? But I think it's just like the really simple act of saying, hey, I'm having a hard time.
I call it emotional flatulence. Just
Of course you do.
Of course I do. So it's more just simply admitting that we've kind of come to the end of ourselves.
Yeah.
That's kind of,
I talked about authenticity before. So vulnerability and authenticity are major buzzwords. I get that. It's actually really hard to go around in the world pretending. Like we've all done it. And it's hard. It makes us sick. When we're not true to ourselves, when we can't be open and honest about what we're experiencing, it will make you physically ill. And it's a lot of hard work. And I think there's this fear of vulnerability of saying, hey, I need a little bit of help. We talk about like vulnerability is not a weakness. If it was a weakness, it would be easy. It's not. It's one of the most difficult things you can do. And I wouldn't reference doing the most difficult thing in the world to you as being weak. Like it's like an oxymoron. But I think men aren't allowed that space. They haven't historically also been allowed to have that space to be themselves. And there's all this pressure and these pressures to be the man and to be all of these things. But all that is leading to inauthenticity, which leads to not only sickness in your body, but sickness in your relationships.
You said we're not allowed to do that. And that's something I'm realizing more and more. It's happening just like in my own marriage, like with my wife, as we grow, like we're much better. I'm much better at that with her now than when we were first married. But like we're often as men not allowed to be that kind of a man. So there's that, but also we don't have a lot of models for that. No one taught us. Like for me, if I think about my own journey into this work and the things I've learned about masculinity, I did not have the words to communicate the feelings. If I was pissed, I had plenty of words for that, but that's kind of all I had in terms of expressing feelings. And part of that is my dad didn't teach me that because his dad didn't teach him and his dad before him didn't teach him. So there's a generational deficit. And it kind of comes back to the coyote thing. It's like, it's scary. It's scary because we don't know how to do it. And I know for men, I don't think it's a very gendered thing, but I know for men being in a position where we need to do something that we don't know how to do is really scary. And most of the time we would rather not do it.
Sure.
Because we want to, because having mastery over things is considered manly.
Yeah, but wouldn't having mastery over your own emotions be like the pinnacle of that?
No, that's just crazy. That's just crazy talk.
Trick question.
No, you're right. Trick question.
Yeah,
no, you're right.
I think like, and that's like a shift. And I think it's definitely taking place. We're seeing, like, I don't spend a lot of time with young people, but one of my best friends is a teacher, and I'm hearing that the next generation of boys is learning this in some regard.
Yeah.
And I think like two things. First of all, like it's scary. If I've learned anything in my life, it's that we also have a choice over what we're afraid of.
Mm.
We have a choice. Like,
Yeah.
yes, you can choose to be afraid of that, or you can choose not to be afraid of that. Take the steps to figure out a way so that you aren't afraid of that.
And knowing you, like I do, and knowing a lot of like your friends, like you have surrounded yourself over time, over your life, with really good people who will encourage that choice, right? Like you're one of the most authentically connected people that I know. And I really respect that. And it seems really foreign to me. This is kind of like, this is again, a difference between the world that you inhabit and the world that I inhabit. Even though it might be more fearful for you, it oftentimes for me as a guy, and I know I'm not the only one, like it feels really lonely. I think men as a rule are not surrounded by guys who will affirm the things that you're talking about.
We referenced camping with coyotes. Part of that expression for me is to get right with yourself and to be still and to confront. When you can confront some of these things and you get right with yourself, you move through the world differently. And I think this is kind of what happens to me, right? So I move through the world differently. And because I'm sort of, I guess, self-actualized in that, and I know myself, identity crisis apart, right? I've come a long way from that.
Yeah.
When I show up as myself, all I'm doing is giving everybody else permission to show up as themselves.
Confidence breeds confidence.
Yeah, but it's not even confidence per se. I think it's just an acceptance of myself, good and bad.
So acceptance, or really, it's humility.
Oh, tricky. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and humility does breed humility. Yeah.
So I think for men, work on yourselves. Work on yourselves, and you will see a ripple effect take place among your family and your friends and the other men in your life. The more that you can show up as an authentic and vulnerable, and hey, still very manly man, that's like no one's taking that away. You worry about yourself in that regard, and then it will start to ripple out, and you'll start to sort of attract people who sort of behave in that way. And then before you know it, you have like a built-in support system, and then you have a community, and you have your sense of belonging and everything that we talk about at Epic Project.
Every time I talk with you like this, when we have these conversations, like, oh man, there's no wiggle room, you know.
Good thing this is a video podcast, so everybody can see your face.
I know. Like, oh man, yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's hard to dismiss that for sure. The work you do is hard. We know. I mean, the work we do is hard. We know that, and you have seen some things, both professionally and obviously personally, like you talked about, that are difficult. What for you is life-giving, and how do you spend your time in ways that like reinforce you? Because you're just in this every day. Like, what are the things that really bring life and creativity and energy to you?
I knew this question was coming as the producer of this podcast. I know you ask all your guests.
So you have a spreadsheet? Is that, yeah?
I do have a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
It is kind of cool to be on the other end of this of this interview, by the way. I have this expression that I use, and I call it maintaining my devotion to living in awe. Like awe, A-W-E. And I try to be devoted to awe, meaning I try to look at the world through eyes that are in awe of nature or beauty. Actually, for me, it's more people. I think the photographer in me, I have like this built-in desire to want to like look at people in their faces and study their expressions.
Yeah.
And that has served me well as a photographer. But I think that is a practice to just look at the world and tell yourself, what I see is going to bring me moments of awe. And it's like, it's part gratitude, part like letting go of like things we can control. But so I try to do everything through that lens first off. And I even have like a secret Instagram account. It's not secret, but it's just my private one. It's not my Ride My Road one. And I just do black and white photos. Like if I'm looking and I see like, if I'm on a walk and I see like water on a spider web, and the sun's like hitting it. Yeah. So I'm like actively seeking for things that are really, really cool and beautiful and moving and sentimental. And so I think that's a practice that I've been able to continue on. And I think it saves me in this work as well. But I also just do a lot of stuff, like I ride motorcycles and I camp, and I have a really beautiful community of friends, and I'm going on a cruise next weekend with my two best girlfriends, and I take drum lessons.
Yes, that's why I want to make sure you said it. And
I'm taking drum lessons. Yeah, I'm just kind of like a passionate person, and I'm always kind of looking for something that might like challenge me and light me up, and yeah. So I kind of, to answer your question, I do a lot. I love reading spy novels. I'm like, I watch pretty much a movie every single day. I love cinema. I love cinematography.
You're a science fiction nerd.
I do like sci-fi. I love,
or I should say Marvel.
The Marvel universe. You might not find a bigger MCU fan. So that's another nerd alert for you.
Yeah, the motorcycle thing. One of the things that I get a kick out of is you and I both share that passion for motorcycles, and we've done some riding together. But you are so safety conscious in your practice of motorcycle riding. And now you've become this annoying noise in my head about safety, because if this is the difference between you and I, like if it's 100 degrees, I'm in a t-shirt and jeans and a half helmet. If it's 100 degrees and Lauren's riding, she's got a full jacket, full face helmet, gloves, heavy boots, motion activated brake light? My motion
activated brake free. Shout out to my sponsor.
Yeah. It's so different, but the passion is the same there. And like I said, I mentioned earlier, you're petite, but I think that fearlessness comes through. I remember in Sturgis, I dared you to drive my 900-pound Indian motorcycle.
Yeah.
And you didn't drive it far, but you also didn't blink. He goes, "Yeah, I'll do it." So she got on it.
I didn't drive it far. Okay, let's be honest here. I parked it. And I could not reach the kickstand. I couldn't.
I did. I had to come help you with that.
I literally couldn't reach the kickstand. And I will say, yes, I like to ride safe, because sometimes my mom listens to these podcasts. So it's important for me to declare to the world. But I just really like my skin. That's why I wear all the gear.
Well, like I said, I hear you in my head. So I am always encouraged and challenged and mildly annoyed with the wisdom that you always bring. So I want to, as is our tradition, I want to give you the last word, but I want to tweak it just a little bit. I want you to share a last word to our guys. You are a trusted leader in this work. You are it's weird. You're one of the guys. You know that. Yep. They know that about you. I want you to have a last word and speak to our guys, or to the men that are listening to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wish you could see yourselves through the eyes of the women who love you. I think men are beautiful creatures. And I think there's so much goodness and strength inside of you, and so much ability to affect those around you, and to hold that place in your homes and in your workplaces. And, we do talk a lot about masculinity being under attack, and that's not without value, right? We spoke about all of the women who have experienced abuse, but that aside, I hope that men can give a little credit where credit's due within themselves, and take the time to appreciate yourself and all the good that you do bring and all the good that you have done. And don't be so hard on yourself. I see so many men in my life. You guys are so hard on yourselves, and you're doing it all alone. Like, it's not that, like, women are hard. We're hard on ourselves, especially I think moms and kind of the culture that we live in. But we do it as a community, and I want that for men. I want you guys to see the beauty in yourselves and reach out to your friends and see the beauty in each other. And through that sort of stuff I was talking about earlier, the self-actualization, like, learn to just be yourself and to be honest and authentic. And you'll see the other men in your life start to do that too. So take a stand for yourself. And again, I'll just repeat that you guys are beautiful creatures. And I sure am grateful for the men in my life.
Lauren Trantham, you are full of wisdom and hope, and you're a blessing. And I'm glad you're part of our team.
Thanks, Tom. Me too.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.